Welcome to U.S. History to 1877. In this course, you will survey the major themes, events, and ideas of American history through Reconstruction.
I'm Jordan O'Connell, History and Government Instructor at Northeast Iowa Community College. This lecture distills a decade of my written notes taken from Alan Brinkley's The Unfinished Nation, The American Yawp, and our course-assigned OpenStax U.S. History textbook. This lecture focuses on victory, debt, and the empire that won too much. The core question is this: how did war debt, frontier diplomacy, and colonial assemblies turn British victory into a shared argument over imperial authority? The core competency is to discuss the development of democratic institutions and the emergence of a common colonial identity after the French and Indian War.
Did British victory in North America strengthen imperial control, or did it expose the administrative pressures that would tear the empire apart? Did British victory in 1763 strengthen the empire, or did it expose the tensions that would break it apart? The answer begins before the final victory and before the tax crisis. It begins in the Ohio Valley, where rivers, forts, native diplomacy, and land claims turned imperial rivalry into a daily political problem. The French and Indian War is often treated as a prelude to the American Revolution, which is true but thin. The war also remade how colonists thought about distance, coordination, defense, debt, and authority. It turned scattered provinces into partners of necessity and then showed them how little control they possessed once imperial administrators came to collect the costs of empire. George Washington's early mission into the Ohio country helps make the tension concrete. Virginia's land interests pushed west. French forces built forts to secure routes from Canada to Louisiana. Native nations understood the valley as their own strategic world, not as empty space between European flags. When Washington carried British demands and later returned with military force, he walked into a contested region already crowded with sovereignties, alliances, and claims. His presence did not start the whole struggle. It revealed how easily local ambition could pull a wider empire into war. The civic problem appears immediately. What happens when a war that seems to secure empire instead exposes the empire's administrative weakness? War requires supply, planning, credit, negotiation, and obedience. Victory magnifies those same requirements because the winning power must now hold territory, manage borders, reward allies, restrain settlers, and pay the bills. British North America learned that military success and political stability do not automatically travel together. The Ohio Valley sat at the center of the conflict because it linked waterways, fur trade routes, military movement, and future settlement. French officials wanted a chain of forts connecting their northern and southern possessions. British colonists, especially speculators and land-hungry elites in Virginia and Pennsylvania, wanted survey lines, grants, and access for Western settlement. Native nations such as the Shawnee, Delaware, and Mingo operated within the region through diplomacy, trade, and military decision. No power could pretend the area was neutral. French imperial practice in the interior often depended more heavily on forts, trade relationships, and native alliances than on dense settler occupation. British colonial expansion looked different. It carried families, surveyors, title claims, and hunger for acreage. Native leaders understood that difference. Balancing French and British power sometimes preserved bargaining room. The collapse of that balance threatened dispossession. The war widened when local conflict became part of the larger 7 Years' War, a global struggle between Britain and France. The scale must remain in view. Events in the Ohio Valley connected to naval war, Caribbean wealth, European diplomacy, and imperial credit. That wider frame explains why the war proved so expensive and why London later insisted that the colonies help carry the cost. Braddock's defeat in 1755 shows how badly imperial force could misread North American conditions. General Edward Braddock marched with British regulars toward Fort Duquesne, bringing artillery, baggage, and formal drill into terrain that favored ambush and local knowledge. French forces and native allies shattered the expedition. The defeat damaged British arms and colonial confidence at the same time. It showed colonists that imperial power on paper did not always function well on the ground. Supply lines could fail. Commanders could ignore local advice. Regular troops could break under frontier warfare. That sharpened the colonial problem because it sharpened a question already visible. If imperial protection is inconsistent, how much authority should imperial officials claim over local assemblies and local defense? The war did not answer that question cleanly. It made it larger. The campaign also exposed the logistics of empire. Braddock needed wagons, horses, road crews, flour, salted meat, powder, shot, and local guides who knew river crossings and forest routes. Colonial governments argued over requisitions and pay. Farmers negotiated over supplies. Teamsters wanted compensation before hauling cannon through rough country. Officers expected movement on schedules the terrain refused to honor. A regular army could look impressive in formation and still fail when it had to drag artillery through mud, while depending on contractors and colonists who did not trust distant command. Benjamin Franklin's Albany Plan of Union in 1754 belongs near the center of the record because it treated war as an administrative problem. The colonies needed coordination in diplomacy, defense, and taxation. Franklin proposed a president general appointed by the crown and a grand council chosen by the colonies. The design tried to bridge imperial oversight and colonial participation. The plan failed, and its failure reveals the pressure on every side. Colonial assemblies did not want to yield taxing and governing power to a larger intercolonial body. The crown did not want to create a unified colonial political structure that might one day resist imperial policy. Each side feared a loss of control. The result was fragmentation at the exact moment a larger war required coordination. Assemblies were not irrational. They had grown used to controlling appropriations, salaries, and many local administrative functions. Through those assemblies, colonists practiced self-government, defended charters, and argued over local taxes. To surrender that authority would mean more than bureaucratic reform. It would mean changing the location of political trust. A legislature in Boston, Williamsburg, or Philadelphia looked more accountable to colonists than a distant authority organized above them. British officials and military leaders faced their own pressure. War meant wagons, rations, uniforms, gunpowder, barracks, pay, and naval support. Armies consumed enormous sums. The capture of Quebec in 1759 and final victory in 1763 brought prestige, Canada, and more interior control, but they also brought larger obligations. Forts had to remain staffed, trade had to be regulated, native relations had to be managed, colonial settlement had to be supervised or restrained. Victory expanded the empire's to-do list. At the same time, it expanded the empire's debt. Native leaders faced the narrowest margin for error. Once France weakened, the diplomatic field changed sharply. A British empire without a French counterweight could become a settler empire with fewer reasons to compromise. Pontiac's War in 1763 reflects that danger. Native resistance was a political response to British arrogance, frontier pressure, and the fear that forts and traders would be followed by permanent settler occupation. Fiscal pressure gave those military facts their political edge. Britain financed the war through borrowing and taxation across the empire. Victory celebrations in London sat beside debt service, garrison estimates, and post-war supply costs. A larger empire required more soldiers in peacetime, more custom staff, more transport funding, and more diplomatic spending on the frontier. Once the war ended, ministers asked why colonies that had benefited from defense should not help maintain the forts and administrative apparatus that defense required. Colonists heard the same question as a challenge to the spending authority of their assemblies. Franklin's Albany Plan landed on the table as machinery, not prophecy. Its key idea was that a general government may be formed in America for their common defense and other shared purposes. Those lines reveal the pressure because they prove colonists could imagine a larger administrative structure before they imagined independence. Franklin's language also exposed the limits of that imagination. Franklin did not call for dissolving the empire. He called for a system that could coordinate the empire's North American parts more effectively. That makes the plan structurally important. It asks the same questions later constitutional design would ask. Who appoints officers? How are representatives chosen? Who raises money? What powers remain local? What powers move upward for common use? The failure of the plan is what gives the document its force. Colonists liked local control more than they liked administrative efficiency. Imperial officials liked colonial assistance more than they liked colonial empowerment. The plan therefore sat in the narrow space where necessity demanded common structure, but political trust could not sustain it. That tension clarifies the crisis because many later accounts assume common colonial identity appeared only after Parliament taxed the colonies. The Albany Plan shows an earlier stage. Colonists could see the practical need for union under military pressure, yet they could not agree on the kind of union or the terms of authority. Shared danger produced shared design talk, but not shared sovereignty. The plan also clarifies the difference between cooperation and consolidation. Colonies could cooperate episodically through congresses, requisitions, or wartime action, while still refusing a stronger central mechanism. That pattern would continue long after Albany. In that sense, the document is less a failed footnote than a diagnostic tool. It tells us where fear of larger government already blocked solutions to common problems. The document also foreshadows later constitutional habits. Americans would repeatedly prefer a weak coordinating structure during crisis, and then discover that weak structures struggled to raise money, move supplies, and enforce decisions. Albany shows the pattern early. Delegates could describe the need for a common defense mechanism. They hesitated when that mechanism required them to surrender patronage, revenue control, or appointment power. Albany belongs in the same family as later disputes over requisitions, taxation, and federal authority. When Britain defeated France in 1763, many colonists expected reward. They expected safer frontiers, access to Western land, and respect for their wartime effort. Instead, they encountered a new imperial logic. London saw debt, military obligations, and frontier instability. The Crown issued the Proclamation of 1763, drawing a line along the Appalachians and restricting settlement beyond it. From the imperial side, the line aimed to limit conflict, manage trade, and prevent another costly frontier war. From the colonial side, it looked like a break on opportunity. The fiscal mechanism must remain visible here. Debt did not hover as an abstract moral burden. It sat in ledgers, bond obligations, military budgets, customs projections, and ministerial calculations. Britain had spent heavily to defeat France. Ministers and members of parliament now asked whether colonial subjects should contribute more directly to imperial maintenance. That question set the stage for the revenue controversies that followed. The proclamation line also deserves to be read as law on a map. A line drawn in London could affect surveyors, speculators, veterans, land companies, county officials, and native diplomats. It could delay patents, redirect migration, and increase smuggling or illegal settlement. A frontier boundary was not symbolic. It was a governing device, and many colonists resented being governed that way after victory. The long consequence is that the war taught two lessons at once. Colonists learned they could coordinate when danger required it. They also learned that British victory might tighten imperial supervision rather than loosen it. Native nations learned that the defeat of France narrowed the diplomatic options that had once limited British and colonial advance. British officials learned that empire without firmer control could prove expensive and unstable. None of those lessons fit neatly together. Colonial political culture changed in the process. Assemblies that had voted supplies during wartime now had fresh reasons to defend their own taxing and spending authority. Frontier settlers ignored proclamation boundaries in practice, which forced imperial officers either to enforce unpopular policy or tolerate defiance. Merchants watched customs rules grow more consequential. Land companies lobbied for Western access. Veterans expected reward in land or status. Every part of the empire attached a different claim to the same victory, and the imperial state lacked a trusted mechanism for satisfying all of them. The unresolved judgment, therefore, remains live. Did the war fail because Britain demanded too much afterward, or because colonists expected victory to erase imperial authority over land, debt, and frontier management? The answer clarifies the stakes because the road to rebellion began here, in the gap between colonial expectation and imperial administration. Once that gap opened, every later tax, decree, and protest would pass through it. Victory over France did not settle the cost of empire or the terms of obedience. The harder judgment is whether Britain asked too much after 1763, or whether colonists had already learned to treat imperial protection as something they could consume without fully paying for. That argument remained unresolved when the shooting ended and the taxing began.
If you're curious how I'm using AI to build these lectures and reshape higher education, visit thelibertytolearn.com. I'll see you in class.